Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. After the lunch this morning, we had very exciting discussions about important areas of reform in Egypt, starting by the full economic picture and learning very much about the efforts that Egypt has been doing during the last years that are already paying off, and we are looking into positive economic figures. We complemented with a very good discussion about the public sector governance and how the quality of the institutions are an important condition for the main topic of the day, making reform happen. And now I'm very, very glad and very honored of moderating this panel with very distinguished speakers that will address a fundamental issue in all this context: what is the role of the private sector and how to build an economic model that has the capacity to promote inclusive growth, to create jobs, and attract investment, which is one of the main priorities for the development plans of Egypt. On that, and building on the reflections that were done this morning on the economic model of Egypt and how to make this more efficient, you know that the OECD is a very figures-centered organization. We like to give the figures and the data for things. And I was thinking that maybe an interesting comparison would be on some key facts between comparing the Egyptian economy and other emerging markets, in particular Latin America and Southeast Asia. And then we can see that the performance of the economy is a bit different in some of the aspects. One difference is when we see the low economic participation, in the sense that only 51% of the population in working age is active in Egypt, whereas in Latin America is 65% and Southeast Asia 69%. One important factor on this is the low participation of women. Only 24% in Egypt as compared to 52% in Latin America and 59% in Southeast Asia. We are talking about less than half in terms of the women participation in the economy, which is not only a factor of fairness, it's also a factor of competitiveness and efficiency of the economic model. Unemployment is also high. As we know, the total unemployment in Egypt is 11.7%. as compared to 8% in Latin America and only 4% in Southeast Asia. And if we look into the youth unemployment, is around 29.5% in Egypt compared to 18% in Latin America and 10% in Southeast Asia. So we see that there is a difference of performance that, of course, it's very important to understand and to see what are the factors that can help to make the necessary reforms to approximate the performance of the economy from other experiences. Two elements come to the attention very quickly, and I will be very short because the panelists have very important things to share with us. One is the level of economic integration, the openness to the economy, to the global economy, trade, investment, flows, participation in global value chains. We see that we are still advancing, but not yet there in terms of the level of integration. But the second very important thing is the structure and the participation of the private sector in the economy. We see in these economies that have made big efforts, and they are led by the private sector that has only the capacity to create jobs and to have the results we are looking for. Economic integration and private sector-led economy are not two separate things, but are very interconnected. Economic integration is an incentive, very important, very powerful incentive for private sector development, and only the economies that have a strong private sectors are able to integrate in an efficient manner. So it's important sometimes looking at the two sides together. Then, of course, how to create the conditions for better integration in the world economy and a stronger private sector brings to the topic of our day, the reforms. Which reforms can facilitate a better business environment, what structural reforms can facilitate this new role of the private sector. We can talk about the content of some policies, competition, investment, state-owned enterprises, they were mentioned this morning. But I would also make a final reflection, which is also the content of today's discussions, is not only about the content of the policy, is how the policy is conducted. So reforming the conditions for the private sector cannot be done without the private sector. It's not only about creating the conditions for that, it's also listening to the private sector, making of the private sector an agent of change. So this political economy of reform, this making reform happen, this how to conduct the policy reform, how to design the policies, calls for a strong public-private partnership. In the OECD, we have been implementing for several years the MENA OECD initiative on governance and competitiveness with a very important leadership from Egypt. And I can tell you that the priority now in the region, in all the countries, and it also reflects what is the experience of the OECD countries, is that this strong collaboration and this partnership between the public and private sector is very much at the core of the interest and an important priority for many. So this was my little introduction, so to discuss how to attract investment, how to build policies that in Egypt allows for flourishing in the private sector and creating more jobs and opportunities is the topic of our session. And for this, as I mentioned, I'm very glad having a very impressive panel of experts. We will start with Dr. Gehan Saleh, who is advisor for economic affairs at the cabinet of the Prime Minister of Egypt. Doctor, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation and for the whole event. I really would like to thank the EECS for this event and the OECD as well. It's very challenging to talk after lunch, but I guess those who are staying there, they want to listen, so that makes people more energetic to talk. Actually, the topic of our session is a very important topic, because if we look at what is the main objective of all the indicators or all the numbers that we're looking at when we think as economists, at the end of the day, it builds at a better quality of life. It builds, or it's up to the welfare of the people, the welfare of the citizens, the welfare of the Egyptians, a better standard of life and a better quality of life. Now, how do we achieve that? We achieve that by raising the income of the population, giving more jobs, and making people afford to live with their income. Now, that definitely requires that we need investments. And not only investment, but when we analyze and we look at the economy, we found that in order for the economy to flourish and to be pushed as a government, we studied the economy and we looked at the economy several years ago, and we found that the most important thing that we have to focus on is investment, industrialization, and exports. Now, without these three drivers, we won't be able actually to sustain the growth. Now, we have done some good growth recently, but in order to be sustainable, we need to have investment, the industrialization, and the exports. Now, thinking about investment or looking at investments, we have to look at what we can do to make our environment, our business environment competitive, because we can't actually seek investment by just trying to say that we are attracting investment or we want investment. Everyone wants investment, but we have to make the environment that we have, the business environment, to be competitive and to be attractive for the investment. Now, if we look at the absorptive capacity of investment, now each country has to look at how much investment we can absorb. Then we have to look at the absorptive capacity of the investment. We can actually divide that into two parts, or I can divide them into 2 parts. We have a hardware that we have to do, and there is a software. The hardware is the infrastructure. We need to have a strong infrastructure. We need to have the energy available. We need to have the sustainability of electricity, because without that, we won't be able to attract investment. And we have done a lot in this area. Infrastructure, whether we're talking about roads, whether we're talking about energy, we have done a lot, and we invested a lot in order to make the Egyptian environment attractive for investors, foreign and domestic, because we're not only seeking the foreign without the domestic. We have to seek the domestic as well, because if we don't have domestic investment, we won't have credibility with the foreigners to attract them to come and to make an investment in Egypt. Now, what remains is the software, or what remains is the other part beside the hardware or the infrastructure. When I say software or hardware, this screen, for example, if the software is off, then we won't see anything here. So the hardware and the software, they're very important to complement each other. Now, the software to complement the absorptive capacity for the investment is, as mentioned before, maybe in the previous session, when we talk about the laws, the regulations, and the access to finance. Regarding the laws and regulations, there has been some speech about the IRADA, right? IRADA and the laws and regulations. And there has been a call that IRADA has been under the Ministry of Industry and Trade to be not related to the minister or to the person or to the ministry itself, but it has to be the vision of the country. And that actually has happened. Recently, the IRADA actually has been moved to the Prime Minister level. And now we are just waiting for the Board of Trustees to be formed, and then we start to continue the work, because definitely we believe that this work that has been done in this initiative is very important. And as long as we have overlapping rules or laws and regulations, that's going to be an obstacle for the investment. And for definitely we have to make the road clear for the investors, not having this overlap in laws and rules and regulations. So that's regarding IRADA. Access to finance, definitely access to finance could be one of the obstacles or could be one of the challenges for investors. And for that, actually, when we think about the value chain of industrialization, and we look at the SMEs or the small medium enterprises and how they fit in the integration, backward and forward integration for the industry and the funding for the SMEs, we do have the small medium enterprise body under, again, the Prime Minister supervision, and we do have the fund for them. But parallel to that as well, there are banks, and there is the central bank, who are giving other initiatives for providing finance and access to finance for industries and for the small medium enterprises. However, this is not enough. We totally understand that. But again, when we think about the monetary policy, the objective of the monetary policy is not necessarily the objective of providing finance for the industry, but they have objective for inflation, for example, objective for stabilization of the currency. Now, once these objectives are achieved, then they can be at ease and provide the finance or to give the access of finance. Recently, we have noticed some kind of decline in the inflation rate or some kind of stabilization in the inflation rate, which is going to give the road for the monetary policy in order to start to digest or to reduce the interest rate and to have more funds or accessibility for funds for the investors or for the industry in order to be competitive. Now, all the factors that are making, or all the indicators, or all the numbers internationally that are giving tough time for Egypt as rank in the indicators, we are aware of them. We're working on them step by step. One of them, for example, the Doing Business Index, or the deterioration of the rank of Egypt in the Doing Business Index. For example, the cross-border trade, we are aware of that for sure, and we're working in order to solve the problems and the obstacles that makes borders or trade across the borders much easier. Now, again, creating jobs and creating investment requires a lot of factors integrating together. These factors, they have to be working simultaneously, not sequentially in so many cases. And working simultaneously together with those factors is going to make the steps much easier, and is going to make it faster, more or less. I think I will stop here, and I'll be ready for any questions regarding whether the competitiveness of the business environment or what the government is doing in order to create a competitive business environment. And I'd like also to listen to the other panelists with me so we can complement each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important intervention. Well, actually, we are very glad that the OECD and Egypt are collaborating very much in the area of investment. Egypt is an adherent to the OECD Declaration of Investment and Multinational Enterprises, a very active member of our investment committee, and we are currently conducting the second full investment policy review of Egypt that is very advanced and hopefully will be launched before the end of the year. So for us, it's very important collaborating with Egypt in one of our important standards. And with this, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Madame Sara Bertin, Chief Country Economist of the Country Office of Egypt of the African Development Bank.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. The first things I would like to say is contrary to everything that has been said this morning, and I'm going to contradict Nicolas' graph of the evolution of the level of poverty, is that Egypt must be doing something right. Because since the 1960s, its population has been multiplied by 3, and its poverty level has been going down. It used to be in the 90% in the 60s. It's now in around 30%, even if it went up since 1999, with the population being multiplied by 3, and numerous crises in the last 40 years, 50 years. We had crises in 71, in 80, in 90, and in 2000. So despite all of that, the country must have been doing something that works. It doesn't mean that certain things cannot be done and push further. We really see this time a push for reforms that we haven't seen. I used to work in Egypt 10 years ago in another capacity, and the push for reform is genuine this time. It doesn't mean, and a lot of people this morning talked about implementation. I'm going to talk very briefly, because I only have 7 minutes, about investment. And I do believe that one of the issues concerning private investment is an issue concerning the implementation of reforms, or at least that was some information that was communicated to us by the private sector. Nicolas showed some very clear graphs this morning about the evolution of total investment and private investment. We saw it going up, and then with the 2007 and 2008 crisis going down, we saw an upward trend before 2011 and then down again. Hasn't clearly completely recovered. However, one thing that is striking and very specific to Egypt, even if it's a trend in most of the developing countries, but it's very salient here, is that public investment is high, private investment is not. And I think, as Nicolas and Carlos mentioned, the work of the OECD is try to have evidence-based policy decision. I believe strongly that as a community, we need to do more work and more understanding why private investment is not taking place in Egypt. Some people are going to tell you it is not the case because of the importance of the state in the economy. It is true that it's important. It's around 65%. But if you look at other countries in the world, many countries, and I'm French, I will know about it, many countries in the world had historically a huge share of the economy being related to the state. It didn't preclude private investment. Now, we are talking about the cost of credit. It is true that the cost of credit is high here. It's around 20% to borrow commercially from a bank. But the rate of inflation is 14%, so your real rate is 6%. Now, 6% is high, but when you have a market of more than 100 million people, is it that high? What is your expected return? I'm not sure it's far below 6%. So I'm not 100% sure that the cost of credit is an argument that precludes all the others. Then the demand for credit. When we look at the demand for credit, I'm not sure it's there. I don't see a crowding out when I talk to investors. I haven't talked to any investor yet who say, oh yes, I had that fantastic project, but I couldn't get the loan. I've been here only 9 months, but I haven't encountered such an investor. 2 weeks ago, the Compact for Africa has as one of its pillars the private sector, and the World Bank organized with Vice Minister Kushuk a talk with private investor and private entrepreneur. And they mentioned few things that I think are extremely important. The first one it was called this morning implementation. I will say that the devil is in the detail. When you talk to a private entrepreneur, they say that all those reforms, they don't trickle down to the level of the bureaucracy. So they talk with somebody at custom which is not aware of the latest changes, or they are still facing red tapes that do not exist in the law anymore. But when you go to do what you need to be done, people are not aware of it. I think that must be the case in a lot of countries that went to reform, and I hope that with time and training, that things will disappear. The second thing, and it's the last thing I'm going to say because I'm close to my 7 minutes, could be one of the specificity of the Egyptian case. A lot of the private enterprise I've been talking to, and what was mentioned in that conference 2 weeks ago, was the unpredictability. People in Egypt and private enterprise feel that the role of the state and the decision of the state concerning the next strategic sector of the economy is unpredictable. And we know that humankind cannot make good decisions under uncertainty, especially entrepreneurs. They need a certain level of predictability of taxes, and they don't know. So it is true that if you are a private enterprise and you decide to go into a market when suddenly it became a strategic sector for the state, you are going to be facing a de facto monopoly. That's not very sexy to start a company. So that could be one of the reasons. I don't know if it's accurate or not. We haven't done the research yet. But I do believe that that will be very interesting research to do, either by a survey talking to entrepreneurs, but to really know what are the impediments and where lies the specificity of Egypt. I would like to finish by mentioning some work that another country in the MENA region did to revive its private sector, and that's Morocco. Most of the economic fabric of Morocco is small and medium enterprises, even super small medium enterprises at the level of the family. But the country has developed an entire strategy to, first of all, push those companies into the formal sector with some very strong fiscal incentive. And that has been kind of successful. You've been working on Morocco, you can rebound on that. They have also done a lot of non-fiscal support to those small companies. They are giving special incentive for those companies to participate more to public markets and the offering of public contract. They are also working on providing social protection for people within this company. I do believe, anecdotal evidence, I've been in Egypt for 9 months. There is an entrepreneurial spirit. I live in Zamalek. Everybody that you can need or think that you will need can be taken care of. And it's very often taken care of by informal people, but with a great entrepreneurial spirit. You want to buy some furniture, you want it differently, they will do it for you. I do believe that in working with small and medium enterprise and very small enterprises, there is a definite way for Egypt to increase the participation of the private sector and avoid that issue of unpredictability that has been mentioned very often. That's where I would like to stop.
Merci beaucoup, Sara, pour cette intervention. Several important elements, but I would underline the importance of the information that you can get from the private sector, listening to the private sector, being really attentive to their demands and their assessment of the situation. This partnership is indeed important for the quality of the policy. And I'm finally very pleased to give the floor to Dr. Ziad Bahaa, founder of the Thebes Consultancy and former Deputy Prime Minister of Egypt with large experience in government and also in the private sector. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really very pleased to be participating in an OECD and ECS event. When I worked in government many years ago as head of the investment authority, one of our standards was to try to see always what OECD sets as a standard, and that I think had become one of the goals of the government to benchmark itself against OECD standards, and I think this is a very good approach to doing things, and so I have a lot of respect for the OECD research and the OECD advisory given to countries around the world. Investment, it's in a way the most important subject today, and yet it's the one thing that has been consistently problematic over so many years, not in the same way, not with the same intensity, not around the same issues, but the truth is we have been struggling with the issue of investment in this country for a number of decades now. Things got better at some points, more difficult sometimes, but on the whole, it is not a problem, but what the French call a problématique, إشكالية, which is, I think it's a fancy word for problem. It just sounds more serious, so I will just refer to it. But there it is. It's a continuous struggle, not trying to improve investment climate, but frankly trying to figure out what really is at the heart of this subject that makes it so difficult, such a difficult nut to crack. Dr. Gehan has presented an important entry point, which is to distinguish between software and hardware, as you said, and I think it's a good way to project it. I think actually there are three dimensions. There is the physical requirements of investment, which you called hardware, and I think that no doubt Egypt has done great progress in that front over the last few years. There is also the macro economic indicator side and the stabilization side, where also Egypt has done tremendous effort and achieved some very good results over the last few years. But that what remains is the day-to-day encounter of investors that continues to be more problematic. I'm happy to say that there is consensus again in Egypt, I think, both among government, private sector, international agencies and donors and partners about the necessity to take the economic reform program to that second wave of reform where it tackles the day-to-day nuts and bolts of the economy. I have had a look at the report, albeit briefly. I've been listening to discussions over many years, frankly. And some things are not worth going back to because we all know the importance of rules, of regulations, of transparency, of bankruptcy law, of labor law. It's all been said. So what is a good way to approach this? My suggestion, and I think something that Sara mentioned here, is the clarity, the predictability. And this is important for me because it also reflects a legalistic approach. A legalistic approach means that the rules have to be clear and the outcomes have to be clear. They're not just one thing. It's not enough for the rules to be clear, but the outcomes have to be predictable. And I would like to mention only 5 aspects of that predictability. But what I mean by this really is that we all need, and I say all because this is a problem in society in general. It's not a government specific, it's not media specific, it is something that has to happen in society. We need, when we talk about investment, to simply put on the glasses that makes us all look from the angle of an investor. Be it small, big, international, local, but to just put on those glasses, put on that investment lens and look at things. What is the most striking thing that any investor will want anywhere? It is predictability. Why is that so? Because I have dealt with investors both from a government and private sector point of view all my life. Investors at the end can deal with anything that we throw at them. They will deal with a £10 exchange rate and with a £12 exchange rate. They will deal with a 20% tax rate and with a 25% tax rate. They will build in those factors as part of their production and sale equation, and life will go on as long as everybody can predict the rules and predict the outcomes. So that predictability, that clarity, I think is needed, as I said, in many things, but I will just focus on 5 of those that I feel are very important. One is, what is the nature of our economy? That's not an academic question, and therefore it does not beg an academic answer. We don't need to say we're a purely open economy or we're a purely closed economy. Those modalities anyway don't exist now and almost never existed anywhere in the world except in an age of extremes, as one of the famous historians would say. What we need is some clarity about the nature of the economy so that people can have a common language, common understanding of what makes this economy grow and what makes it prosper. But to find odd statements, odd voices, odd predictions, odd rules being made from time to time just disturbs this common understanding. There has to be a common understanding. This ship is heading in which direction? More specifically, we have to have some clarity about the role of the state in the economy. And I'm clear in saying the role of the state, both the civilian state and the military state, it is one state. At the end, it is called the state. The economy, in my mind, is composed of state, private sector, voluntary or NGO sector. That's it. The state is the state. And we have to have clarity about the role of the state. But let me confess to you, perhaps to the dislike of the chairman of the Egyptian Center of Economic Studies, let me confess to you that I'm not necessarily against state intervention in the economy. Actually, I do believe that the state has a role to play in the economy, and a very significant one, not only as a regulator, but from time to time as a catalyst, as an investor, as a partner. What we do need in this country is clarity. And I think everybody will be happy to see clarity in terms of saying what are the sectors in which the state intends to be an active player, what kind of play will it be doing, will it be investing, will it be funding, will it be guaranteeing, will it be competing, will it be regulating, and some clarity about the time frame that those things take. Is this a long-term permanent position, or is this a temporary stopgap measure that has to be done in order to alleviate poverty here, increase demand there, and so on? So that clarity about the role of the state, if there is one thing I would hope that Dr. Abla one day sponsors as a discussion for this country, honestly, is a workshop, a conference, a dialogue about the future of the role of the state in the Egyptian economy. Not to take too much of your time, there is clarity needed about cost. And I say cost, not taxes. There is clarity about taxes. Of course, Egypt has an income tax rate of 22.5% taxation, and then, VAT and so on. But that's not cost. Cost, and I mean cost paid to the treasury. Add to this a lot of unpredictable cost that comes all the time. It is fees levied by various authorities. It is payments that have to be made when you're transporting goods from one governorate to the other. It is things that have to be paid, and I'm not talking corruption here, by the way. I'm talking official payments made to the public treasury of authorities, governorates, agencies. This unpredictability, I think, is a big obstacle to investment. We boast having a relatively low tax rate, as I said, 22.5%, I think is quite low, to be honest. I would love to see this country go back perhaps to 25, 27% tax rate, provided that comes with a foolproof guarantee that this is the only payment that I will make as an investor towards the public treasury. And that cancels every other levy, every other payment that has to be done from time to time. There is clarity about market information. We just need to have more clarity about market information, and I don't think this is going to be possible to the extent required without something we have been talking about in this country for a long time, which is a Freedom of Information Act. We need, finally, and that's the last thing I would say, people often say we need clarity of rules. obviously important. So you want every agency to write its rules. You want, the law to be known. IRADA is a great initiative. I was honored to be the first head of its board of trustees some 15 years ago when we started collecting these rules and regulations and so on. So the clarity of rules are very important. But the rules don't matter in themselves. It's the outcomes that matter, right? You want the rule to be there, clear, and the application of that rule to be consistent and predictable. And that can only mean judiciary role. The role of the judiciary has to be quick, has to be affordable, has to be clear, and has to be, consistent. Consistency of the rules does not mean that the government agency writes those rules only, but that the applicability of those rules becomes predictable. And therefore, I don't think there is room for talking about improvement of the investment environment without a serious review of the role that is played by the judicial overview and how this is applied, especially to smaller enterprises. Let me just say that what I'm proposing here is just to use that lens. That lens of clarity and predictability will go a long way into defining what the priority should be for this country. I don't think we need a new investment law. I don't think we need to revise our investment law. I don't, frankly, we need an investment law to start with. Investment law was introduced in this country in 1965 as a way to sidestep a bureaucracy that had been built over 30 years of semi-socialist or 20 years of semi-socialist economy. It was meant to be a fast-tracked while we improve the system. This happened in 1971. It's about time we get rid of those fast tracks and we just say from now on there will be no exceptional route to please the investors. The whole thing has to work. And so I don't think, frankly, that putting more effort and resources and discussion into the investment law is the right investment. I'll stop at this point and thank you all very much again for having me and happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bahaa. I was very, very pleased hearing your words about the OECD and our role in setting standards and helping countries to improve their standards. And actually, this is a method that we have been using with Egypt in the past, and we intend to continue in the future. And already we heard today about the country program. This would be a good opportunity. But I would like to connect this with what you mentioned in a very eloquent manner about the necessary reflection about the role of the state in the economy. Because when you talk about the role of the state in the economy, you are talking about state-owned enterprises, you are talking about public procurement, you are talking about tax system, you are talking about quality in regulation, for example. There are standards for all these issues, and there are good practices, and there is an, let's say, international understanding of the elements that would work well and work less well in these elements, and this can be a good orientation when you are making a reflection about how to design the position of the state in the economy in a given country. And the OECD, as you believe that the state has an important role to play in the economy, and like other organizations, we have never promoted radical privatization approaches, for example, but on the contrary, we think that it's essential that state-owned enterprises participate in the market in conditions that are transparent, that there is a level playing field, and the interaction between the private sector and the public sector is built, as you very rightly say, in a predictable manner and with full transparency. So I think we have finished in the panel. Excuse me? It's not working? Okay, yes, thank you. And then, of course, we still have some few minutes for questions from the audience. There are some questions or interventions. Excuse me. Yes. So there are already some colleagues that would like to intervene. Mr. Hani Taufik, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you and to the center. And in particular, Dr. Bahaa, who destroyed my comment, actually. I was taking notes of what to say, but apparently you said almost everything. My only actually worry about the private investment, and I second him actually asking the ECS to hold special event for the impediments and challenges of the private investment in Egypt. But my only worry now at this moment is the crowding out phenomenon that we are seeing from the government. And I may disagree with Dr. Bahaa regarding the role of the government. I'd like the government to intervene only when there is a distortion in the market, but not a rule of thumb that the government should be there. The government as a regulator, an organizer of the business and planning even is okay. But now we see the government and the state is into the real estate sector heavily, to the extent even that the real estate market is going to go to the bubble, hopefully not, but there is a shadow of a real estate bubble. The crowding out in the cement industry, in some sectors that I believe that the government should not have been there. So I would like Dr. Gehan, whom I'm very impressed with, by the way, especially today, to comment on or to take into consideration this worrying phenomenon that we are witnessing these days, the crowding out, whether on the liquidity of the banks to the private sector, to the extent of 80% of the liquidity goes to the government, or into the production sector as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Hussein Shokri, please.
Thank you very much. I want to thank OECD and ECS for organizing this important event. I would like to also thank all the panelists who participated today, and this panel as well. Dr. Ziad Bahaa, always, even though he has been looking for his lens for a long time, but still a very important participation. I have a question for Dr. Gehan, representing the government today. And the question is, how can we achieve, given all what we heard today, how can we achieve sustainable economic growth when we don't have any private, not any, we have very low private sector investment, whether local or foreign. And when we analyze the growth rate that has been achieved, impressive, 5.6%, everybody is applauding, me included, and I think the reforms so far, fiscal and monetary, have been impressive, and everybody agrees. But one should not lose sight that this growth all is coming from government spending and very little from private sector investment. So going forward, how would the government be able to achieve sustainable economic growth? Would it rely on continuous government spending? And why isn't private sector investment coming? We have improved the infrastructure. We have surplus energy. I agree with Dr. Ziad, we don't need investment laws, but somehow there is an impediment. Investments are not flowing to this country. And I would be interested in your opinion. Thank you.
You take some other questions, and then the panelists will answer.
Yes, thank you. I want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I thank the panel for all the very important statements that were made. And I agree completely with what was said. I agree particularly with Dr. Ziad when he said, let's put the lens of the investor. And it reminds me of something that a businessman actually mentioned in Tunisia when we were in the OECD meeting recently, an Italian, as a matter of fact. Okay? And he said, the private sector knows the solution to the problems because they are the ones that have their hands in the mud. So he said, I advise the government to fish in the lake of the private sector because they do have the solution. Fish for what is suitable for the country, but these are the answers. So this is actually extremely important. On the tax part, I agree completely on this predictability. If they do not see what's happening, this is the problem for the investors. But also at the tax level, you can give 40%, okay, and they would take it, as a matter of fact, as a tax, if there is nothing else. But this is not the only thing needed, because we have a very small tax base. There are many people who do not pay taxes. The system itself for tax collection, the perception of the government that the only problem is that the percentage of the tax is small and we need to get more. Okay? But get more from where? Everywhere in the world there are high taxes, but they are associated with high production as well. So you're making more money and the government is taking a bigger share. Right now, you are making more money, the government is killing you, and it's not even giving you what's rightfully yours, like export subsidy or anything. So I'm trying to say that the reform needed is way bigger. A big problem by the investors in the land. They cannot find, there is no access for land. And we know the problem, and we know that there are zillion institutions in charge of land, and yet we are still not fixing it. So it's a governance issue. It's an institutional problem primarily. Okay? The investors are not flowing in because there are many problems, and we do not need an investment law for sure. We need to fix the system once and for all. And I promise from now that we are actually going to have a big discussion on the future role of the state, because it's a must, and we'll do that sometime in September. Dr. Gehan, you are playing an excellent role in the Prime Minister's office, and the perception of solutions is of many things are actually improving, okay? But unless, what is the level of collaboration with the think tanks, with the private sector? Yeah, the government knows that it needs the other stakeholders in the economy, but they are not in the formula, okay? They are not in the formula. Sara, I love your intervention and your role, but there's one little thing that you mentioned that alarmed me a little bit when we said we are less poor than when we were in the 60s. It was a big number. I don't think the comparison with the 60s at this point is the most valid one. I think the entire setup was different. I don't know. I think Egyptians feel more poor today than they were in the 60s. I don't know why, but it's when you ask the older people, they would tell you that they feel actually the poverty rate seems to be higher. It is different because the perception of poverty also has changed over time. Poor is not people who cannot eat, but poor is people who are so far away from everybody else. Sorry for it took a long time.
Ambassador Shema.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos. And I would like to thank the panelists very much. And actually, I would like to thank both the ECES and OECD for the structure of the three sessions, which are very well tied together. In the first or the second, we were talking about the ease of doing business. It relates to both informality, it relates to structural reform, to administrative reform as well, and to processes. And here we're talking about private sector. Sara and Dr. Ziad, you mentioned unpredictability. He mentioned predictability, or the need for predictability, clarity. That's fine and well. And definitely, I don't think there is, somebody who can disagree with the need for that. This reminds me with one of our cooperation partners who once commented on investment, saying that, okay, you do have good investment promotion, activities, saying, come invest in Egypt. Yes, but it does not say come to do what, or to explain what you will be faced with. And that's precisely what Dr. Ziad was referring to, in terms of you have the infrastructure, you have the legal framework, but it's the day-to-day processes that relates not only to investors, and here, by the way, the basic focus should not be on the foreign investor. It is actually on the local investor. And on the local investor, it starts from the micro investor. The model that you referred to, Sara, is quite interesting, of course, providing fiscal incentives and, the discussion that we had. You have to give incentives to those in the informal to join the formal structure. Question to Dr. Ziad Bahaa. Okay, the need for predictability and clarity. In what steps? Besides the law, which is there, besides the infrastructure, which is there, what needs to be done as 1, 2, 3, bearing in mind that there isn't that much time? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Some other question before we move to the panelists? So maybe we can go already to the answers.
Thank you very much for the comments. Actually, they're very fruitful. And thank you very much, Dr. Bahaa. Actually, I really enjoyed your analysis. Crowding out of investment and sustainability of growth, and they are both interrelated, actually. When we think about the sustainability of growth, it has to be definitely relying on increase in the percentage of investment, not only relying on the investments of the state in the infrastructure and in roads and so on, because after a while we won't be able to afford it, and after a while the marginal of it is not going to be as a big injection as it used to be. So for sure investment has to increase. And the percentage of investment of GDP of Egypt is compared to other countries is very moderate. It's not what we are aiming for. And that's why definitely investment is the key factor. Crowding out of investments because of the state participation, again, it is this crowding out from my point, this role of state in investment is going to diminish when we have the private sector having a bigger share or a bigger role of investment. Now, how do we do that? Yeah, how do we do that? I would say one more time, it's the attractiveness of the business environment, which is, we might need to fix what Dr. Bahaa has mentioned about the clarity, about the transparency, about the predictability, because investors, if they see it gloomy, if they cannot build their expectations, then they won't be able actually to set their investment. Again, a rate of return is based on expectations, and if expectations are gloomy, therefore you have a factor that is going to make the rate of return even higher, so that's not going to make the investment environment attractive. All these things, we are aware of them, we're working on them. But one more time, we want things to be institutional. We don't want things to be based on a person. And when we say, the reason I'm saying this statement, because we have realized in the Prime Minister office that there are so many problems facing investors, and we started to take these problems individually, and we made a committee that will tackle these problems for each investor in order to make the environment for them attractive. However, I told the Prime Minister it can't be like that. It can't be just a committee that will solve that. It has to be the whole ecosystem. It has to be the whole system of the economy that is solving the problems, not an individual or based on a certain individual. So I would assure you that all your points are very valuable points, and we are aware of them, working on them, and working on them both ways. In the long run, to have the system to be transparent, credible, and doing the things without depending on a person, and at the same time, on the short run, looking at those specific problems facing a specific investor and solving them. So the word of mouth of investors, when they see that things are being solved, then they can actually have this positive atmosphere or have positive environment that will attract investment. The Prime Minister, again, has set with all the expert مجالس التصديرية, all the experts under all the expert bodies in Egypt to see their problems and what problems do they have and so on. All the business, whether we're talking about اتحاد الصناعات, اتحاد الغرف التجارية, all these, they're always in direct contact with the Prime Minister office. One more time, this is on the short run. In the long run, we're building the system that is supposed to be institutional, not just based on who is in the cabinet right now or who's solving the problems right now.
I'm taking my time and hers, so I get an extra minute. Let's not thank you everybody for the valuable contributions. I will just comment on two things that were directed to what I said. I'll come back to the issue of crowding out, Mr. Hani, if you don't mind. Sure, crowding out is a problem. There's no denial there, I think. Maybe not on credit, but it's on other things. All I'm saying is, let's not make the argument about reducing crowding out with that about reducing the role of the state a unitary one. There is a margin of difference here. I have personally the pleasure and I benefit a lot from visiting my hometown in Asyut once every month, 6 weeks at most, and spending a few days there. And frankly, I don't see a way for an immediate filling up by the private sector of the various services and commodities that need to be supplied in a certain way. So I have to tell you, I continue to see a role of the state even in the supply and the purchase of goods and commodities. But crowding out is a different matter. Crowding out means that when both private sector and state interact in the economic market, then there has to be rules, there has to be a level playing field, there has to be a logic for when the state pulls out and when it intervenes, rather than leave it open to, chance. And the sense that we get now is that there isn't clarity, again, about the rules by which the state is engaging in the economy, not necessarily by the principle of the state engaging in the economy. That's my own bias. To the last question, what do we do? It's difficult to say what to do in a few minutes. And frankly, I have worked in government, and I know it's very easy to say what to do. The application can be quite daunting. Let me just present one idea. It's theoretical a little bit, but I think it's a useful tool. That tool is a distinction that we need to make between legal reform and institutional reform. They often, overlap, but I think it's the vast difference. Because when you say legal reform, it tends to become drafting the laws for something. So the legal reform of the bankruptcy regime means the drafting of a new bankruptcy law and perhaps executive regulations. Institutional reform in bankruptcy means training the judges, the bailiffs, the court system, introducing the IT network that is needed, the record keeping, all of that. We do a lot of legal reform, but institutional reform, I'm not surprised that we do less of, because frankly it is much more difficult. But unless we depart from the idea that legal reform means reforming the laws, it is reforming the institutions, because ultimately it all depends on how the institutions apply those laws. So let's make that distinction, and that is not al-islah al-idari in the sense of Qanun al-Khidma al-Madaniyya, the civil service law. It means the mechanics of applying the law have got to take. Bankruptcy, I think, is an excellent example, because we have just had a new bankruptcy law issued about a year and a half ago. It has done nothing.
I totally agree with what you just say. I think one of the issues in Egypt, and it goes back to unpredictability dash predictability, is what some people mentioned this morning about implementation, what you call institutional reform, what I call the devil is in the detail. And I think it's where we need to see those legal changes take place in everyday life. Let it be when you open a company, let it be when you bring something to custom, let it be at all the different ways where we see it every day not being implemented yet. So I do believe it's a very important point.
Thank you very much. I'm told we are already running out of time, and I want to thank the panelists for this very exciting discussion, and to the audience for very interesting and insightful questions. I think we have learned a lot today about making reform happen in Egypt. We learned about the challenges, we learned about some solutions, about the difficulties, but especially we learned about the necessity of federating efforts, working together horizontally in a collective effort. And I think we have made some progress today in putting together people that have the potential and the envy of working together and providing solutions. And with this, we close this panel. Thank you very much, the participants.
Thank you.